chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Mga anak, sundin ninyo ang inyong mga magulang, alang-alang sa Panginoon, sapagkat ito ang nararapat. Igalang mo ang iyong ama at ina. Ito ang unang utos na may kalakip na pangako. Magiging maganda at mahaba ang iyong buhay sa lupa. Mga magulang, huwag ninyong ibuyo sa paghihimagsik laban sa inyo ang inyong mga anak. Sa halip, palakihin ninyo sila ayon sa disiplina at aral ng Panginoon. Mga alipin, sundin ninyo ang inyong mga amo dito sa lupa nang may buong katapatan, takot at paggalang sa parang si Kristo ang siya ninyong pinaglilingkuran. Gawin ninyo iyan, may nakakita man o wala. Gawin hindi upang mapuri ng mga tao, kundi dahil kayo'y mga lingkod ni Kristo at buong pusong sumusunod sa kalooban ng Diyos. Maglingkod kayo ng masaya ang kalooban na parang sa Panginoon. Kayo naglilingkod, hindi sa tao. Sapagkat alam ninyong gagantimpalaan ng Panginoon ang bawat mabuting gawa ni numan, maging siya man ay alipin o malaya. Mga amo, maging mabait kayo sa inyong mga alipin at huwag silang pagbabantaan. Huwag ninyong kalilimutan na kayo ay parehong alipin ng iisang Panginoon na nasa langit at pantay ang kanyang pagtingin sa inyo.
Well, good morning. Maybe one more try? Good morning. Well, that's good. That's better. Hey, my name is Steve Graves, and my wife and I have been part of fellowship for a long, long time, and I'm happy to be with you this morning, continue to work through Ephesians 6. My wife and I are jumping deep into the grandparent season of life. We have 2 on the ground and 2 in the oven, as I like to say, and that's a ton of fun, just a ton of fun. Not too long ago, we were in Birmingham, Alabama, for a family-wide wedding event. Everybody that kind of was there with us. And my mother-in-law reminded me that when my kids were young, I used to tell kind of these homespun children's stories of animals and colorful characters to my kiddos. And she said, maybe you ought to bring those out of retirement and pull those back into the grandkids. And I said, well, that's an interesting thought, perhaps, if I can actually even remember any of them. And then she said, you remember you also did something called kind of a word of the week, a word of the week. And I said, no, don't even remember that at all. She said, yeah, you used to cook up a word of the week and you would give it to them and it would be something you guys could chat through the week, kind of consequential word. Well, this morning, I'm not going to tell you any homespun children's stories, but I am going to give you a word of the day, perhaps the week, and actually maybe a word that could hold you for a while in life. The word is integration. Say that word with me. One more time, a little louder. Integration. Integration. Now, immediately we can think about stuff like social integration, school integration, business integration. I've been involved in a ton of vertical integrations through business in the last few years. This morning, the word integration actually at its core, it means to kind of blend, to combine, to incorporate parts into a whole. This morning, I want us to bend that word integration around our journey of faith. I want to take the concept of our journey of faith and I want to use the word integration to kind of bring some life to it. Let me explain. Typically what happens is we have our religious world, our faith world is over here, and then the rest of life is kind of over here. Our faith life includes our church life, a Christmas. If you don't do church a lot, you might do Easter, weddings, funerals, crises in life, those kind of things. And then there's this other side of life, which is kind of the real side of life. And they kind of sit separate. Theologians call this the great divide, the sacred secular split, okay? This morning what I want to do is I want to try to push those back together, and we're going to operate with an assumption or a thesis. And the thesis is this. I really believe after 4 decades of studying the scriptures that the gospel of Jesus was intended to inform and to transform the details of my everyday life. Now let that sink in for a second. Read it again. The gospel of Jesus was intended to inform, shape, bring truth, bring context, inform, and then transform. Help me make the changes in life that I actually need to make, that I can't make by myself. That's the intent of the gospel. Now, no book of the Bible addresses this like Ephesians. Ephesians absolutely is designed to prove this point true for us. The first three books of Ephesians are about theology, heavy doctrine, sanctification, atonement, the cross, the church, justification, all that. And then when you get to chapter 4, you jump over, and chapter 4 says, well, this is how we ought to live in light of all that stuff. And then the last 3 chapters actually are about practical application. It takes it into kind of what I do with my life, in the details of my life in light of that. Make sense? That's kind of the big idea. So this morning what I want us to do is this. We're going to continue working our way through Ephesians. Go to your Bibles or go to your phones, or whatever you're reading out of, and go to chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. We're going to tackle some pretty tough topics this morning, okay? Jump in those. Now, before we even jump into the first verse, I want us to tackle a thought that I think is really, really important as it relates to studying theology, or especially trying to get practical in the Bible. And here's the thought. No single verse in the Bible captures all that God thinks about any topic or issue. Now, very, very, very few times are we able to sit down and actually read every verse of the Bible about any particular topic. We're always jumping in and jumping on a few verses, and then we're pulling out, and then sometime later we'll jump on a few other verses. It's important that we remember that no one verse contains all of God's thought. Now, this morning we're going to do this. We're going to try to apply the theology of the first part of Ephesians to my family life and into my work life. We got to remember, though, that there's a lot more verses all over the Bible about family and a lot more verses all over the Bible about work. So we're just going to tackle the ones that are going to show up and work our way through Ephesians. Make sense? All right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you one big insight for children, one big insight for parents, and one big insight on work. Those are going to be kind of the way we kind of work our way through. Let's start off right out of the gate into Ephesians 6, verses 1 to 3 is where we begin. And here's our first big insight. Our first big insight is every child should honor their parents. Now, the book of Ephesians in chapter 6 opens up from the vantage of the child to the parent. It would be very common in this particular day for children to be listening to this book being read in the Ephesian church. They didn't have children's church going on down the hall somewhere. They kind of were all right there. So the children would have been hearing, so it would have been natural for Paul the Apostle to address the children as well. The first principle or first insight I like to at least suggest that we wrap our heads around of how children relate to parents related to the family, the household of faith, is children should honor their parents. And when you look at verse 1 and 2, immediately there are 2 verbs that jump out. Children obey their parents, and children honor your father and mother. Immediately you might think to yourself, well, those are 2 words, must mean the same thing, must be interchangeable. Just kind of one word means the same thing. They're actually not. They're actually 2 different words that mean 2 different things. The word obey is actually from the word in the Greek hupakuo. Kuo, you might recognize acoustics. Akuo is hearing. So obeying is somebody hears something and then they do it. I hear, I do, I hear, I do, I hear, I do, I hear, and I don't do is what? It's disobeying. So the Bible actually opens up and begins building the case that for children early on, young children is the word there, they need to learn how to obey their parents. But there's no way that I believe that obedience, it can be the defining tissue of every parent and every child forever. I think it's kind of the building block. It's the stepping stone. It's the first step. It's the thing that we begin with. It's the thing that helps children learn how to know the difference between foolish living and wise living. Learn the difference between right and wrong. Learn the difference between why authority is important and all of that. It's a first step. It's not the final step. The final step in relating of how a child relates to the parents over the long haul is in our word honor. Obedience is just the beginning. It just gets us going. Now, here's the deal. Remember in the book of Ephesians, there's this backdrop about me and God. So I'm supposed to be learning how to obey God in my life. But there's even something bigger than that, which is this idea of honoring. Honoring is actually a much more rich word, a bigger word, a more powerful word than the word obedience. Obedience is like a duty. Honor is like a disposition. Obedience is just kind of what I do. Honor is kind of how I'm feeling about you and what I think about you. In the Greek, the word honor means to add weight, put value, deposit worth in you. And so somehow, some way, in my role with you as a child, to my parents, I learned how to put weight, to place some more value, to add some worth back into your life. Honor. I actually asked some friends of mine of all ages how they honored their parents. And I want to just read you a couple of these. They were pretty interesting. One person told me that they honored their parents by going and asking their parents questions about their life and then learning how to practice engaged listening. For me, the engaged listening was really interesting. Sometimes I'll ask somebody a question, but I'm not always really engaged in my listening. Number 2, take and eat a meal with them. Show them some pictures off your phone. Build some fullness and some happiness into their soul, to their heart. Number 3, take them on a trip. Check off a bucket list item. 4, replace some things that you learned from them or some of the greatest memories you had when growing up. Now tell me that would not put some value and some worth and some weight into a parent. For a child to say, hey, let me tell you some things I learned from you when I was growing up. Let me rehearse some memories of growing up with you as a parent. Honor is the idea. Honor is the big idea. Here's the last one. Join them in their hobbies and interests, kind of a role reversal. You know, as parents, we're always about the interest and hobbies of our kids. Flip it over. Get involved in the interest and hobbies of your parents. So the big idea, number 1, is this. Generally, every child should learn how to honor their parents. Number 2, every parent should nurture their child. Keep reading. Now, verse 4 kind of busts right out of the middle, and it hits dads right on the head. Fathers, don't exacerbate or don't stir up anger or don't just nag your children in such a way that creates this low-grade bitterness in them for you. Now, I don't believe necessarily that the Apostle Paul nor the New Testament is trying to say that dads alone have problems with this. I think dads in the New Testament certainly did have challenges, for sure, but I think it's more of a parent thing. It comes out very, very fast, and it comes out negative, but it doesn't stop there. Look at the rest of the verse. It says, don't do these negative things. Don't nag your children. Don't do things that are going to steal their spirit. Don't do things that's going to rob their heart, their energy. Don't do something that's going to continually make them have a negative disposition towards you all the time. Now look, I'm not some parenting expert. I'm just trying to teach the text and help us understand what it says. The negative piece of that sits right out of the gate, but then it goes into what I think is one of the most powerful, beautiful words in the New Testament. You see the word build up, bring up? It says, don't do these things, but bring up your child. So a child's job is to honor the parents. The parent's job is to nurture the child. The word bring up is exactly the word in the New Testament that means nurture. It's actually 2 or 3 words in the New Testament that use this and reference it. The most beautiful picture is in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the same exact word traces back there, and it means to rub. Rub. The picture is rubbing the palate of a young child, the lips and the tongue, with crushed dates or oil to do what? Why would you do that? To make the child what? Eat, hungry, feed. The child's not used to eating, and so they're going to crush up some dates, and they're going to wipe the dates around the palate of the child, and the child gets hungry. Says, man, give me some more of those dates. Let me have some more of that oil. What a picture. The parent's job is to nurture, is to somehow create a feeding in the child for self-discovery on their own. Now, here's the interesting thing. That's a really easy picture to imagine when our children are babies, when they're really young. But how does that translate when you kind of start growing them up? I think it's the same thing. I think it's the parent's job to create those things in life that create natural, healthy hunger in the child and the youngster and the teenager to become strong, healthy adults. Make sense? Years ago, I began praying a verse through for me and my wife and my children and my family and even my grandchildren now. And it's this Luke passage. Have you ever seen this passage, Luke 2:52? Jesus grew, and look at the 4 ways that Jesus increased and grew. He grew physically, he grew spiritually, he grew socially, grew physically. I mean, he grew in these 4 different areas. Now, here would be my caution for us. I think it's very easy for parents, at least it was for me, I think it's very easy for parents to over-index on one rubbing or the other. In other words, it's easy for us to over-index on trying to make sure that our children are growing in one area over the other areas. And I think basically the scripture teaches that it's our job as parents to nurture our children for a holistic, a composite approach to becoming a full-orbed adult. Nurture. So here's what we got. We have this picture that the child's job is basically to honor the parents. The parent's job is to nurture the child. And the New Testament is putting this all in the verses that open and end with in the Lord and of the Lord. The idea would be, I have all this theology over here. Somehow integrate those two in the way I do my family life. And the family life, the way the New Testament is approaching it in Ephesians, is simply this. Honors the big idea for children, and nurturing, rubbing, creating hunger, creating an appetite in children for the healthy things in life in a full-orbed way. That's the idea of nurturing. Make sense? Okay, so that's kind of the family idea. And then it goes into verse 5, and stuff gets a little challenging. And it goes into what I think is the second big area, which is work. Work. Now, as soon as you open up and you look at verse 5, look at your scriptures. Verse 5, the very first word of verse 5 is slaves. Now, immediately we have to do some contextualizing to get into the idea, the main idea of verses 5 to 9, I think. The Yale Anchor Bible Dictionary, a very scholarly piece of work, basically tries to make the case that it's really challenging and hard for anybody that sits in the modern world to work your way back through the horrible, horrific 18th and 19th century of slavery to the first century and understand what was going on. They make the case that basically you got to go back to the New Testament days, start there, and work your way this way. In the New Testament, the concept of slavery had nothing to do with race. It was not race-based at all. It wasn't a lifetime. It lasted till they were 30. Let me read you this paragraph to kind of help us contextualize the idea before we jump into the idea of work. Despite the legal distinction between slaves and owners, persons in slavery did not constitute a different social or economic class. Slaves' social status, their lifestyle, their economic opportunity, even their education was tied to the status of their respective masters and developed no recognizable consciousness of being a group of suffering a common plight. In other words, a call of slaves to the world would unite would have fallen on deaf ears in ancient times. In fact, they wanted to be a slave because they didn't want to go look for work every day. The begging question is, why does the New Testament not scream abolish slavery? It seems to actually almost endorse it. I would make the case of this. I would make the case that in the New Testament, the concept of slavery was really about the concept of work. It was later until the 18th century when you meet a man named William Wilberforce. If you've never read about his life, if you've never watched a movie, do yourself a favor. He was a politician in Britain, a strong follower of Jesus, and basically he spent 18 years screaming at the top of his lungs. He bet everything he had, he spent everything he had, fighting the horrible evil slavery that was sweeping through the Caribbean and into the New World. So here's what I'd like to suggest to us this morning. I don't think Ephesians 6 is trying to give us a theological treatise on slavery, not a historical piece at all. I think it's actually talking about work. Just like it's talking about family, it's talking about the idea of work. If you look at verses 6 and 7, there's a bunch of stuff that begins to break open around the concept of work. There's a big idea that I like to at least challenge us with, which is connecting our work to God changes everything. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before or not, but it's a really interesting thought. When I began to connect everything that I do with my work to God, my world kind of begins to shift a little bit. Things begin to move around. I would suggest in the verses of 5 to 9, at the end of this particular section, basically Paul is tackling the concept of work. And when I begin to grab this principle, I understand that work changes the why and it changes the how. The gospel literally flips the why of my work and the how of my work upside down. Let me explain. A book back in 2009 was written by a guy named Simon Sinek, and he says start with why. His case, it's a secular book, but his case is when you ask and answer the why questions of life, you anchor life to something deeper, okay? So here's the question, why do we work? Why do you work the job that you do have? Why do we chase jobs that we don't have? Why do we wish we would have different jobs? What's the why connected to your work? What is it? In Ephesians 1, the verse basically shifts. And you see that phrase, belonging to Christ? You see that? Paul is shifting the customer of my work from being me only to someone else. For most of us, I would argue that my work is basically for me. I work for me, I earn money for me, I'm trying to get fulfillment for me, I'm trying to create a lifestyle for me, and that's the reason I work. And this can be any kind of work, but I'm working for that cause. What Paul does in Ephesians 6 is he takes it and he says, why don't you anchor the why of your work to your identity with Christ? So all of a sudden now I have a different customer on my work. I'm still the customer, but I also have now a bigger customer, a higher customer, a more ultimate customer for why I do all that I do. And the why changes. Make sense? But also the how, and this is where it's really, really practical. This is where the Ephesians book just kind of jumps right off the page. Look at down in verse, the last part of verse 5, and he gives us some hows also. There's 3 quick questions that he pops out and basically tells us when I connect my work to Christ, when my work begins to be embedded in the way I think about belonging to Christ, it's not separate. It's not over here and then my whole church thing is over here. I've wedded those together. Not only is my why changing, but my how changes. Let me show you a couple examples. There's 3 questions. One is in verse 5 and 6, one is in 7, and one is in 8. In 5, it says this. It says, are you wholehearted? Are you sincere in your work? You see that phrase? In the sincerity of your heart, as you would Christ, don't work only while being watched. The idea is sincerity. In the Greek New Testament, there's 2 words. There's one that's called haplos, and there's one that's called douplos. And haplos is the idea of being single-minded or single-focused or solely wholehearted. Duplos would be the idea of duplicity or duplicated or two things. Paul is trying to make the case that when I understand and hook up my work to Christ, it allows me to become single-hearted. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to apply this to the modern world because we live in a gig economy. Everybody has side gigs going on. I'm kind of a portfolio entrepreneur my whole life. I've got a lot of things going on. I do know this, regardless of how many things I might have going on, there's a principle here that talks about me learning how to become sincere, wholehearted, very focused in the thing that I'm working for you. If you're my boss and you've given me a job, I need to learn how to become focused, single-focused. That's the first question. The second is, what kind of attitude do you take to work with you every day? You say, Steve, you don't understand my job. You don't understand the work I do. You don't understand the boss I have. You don't understand, I work in a horrible place. That's true. But the way I understand it is we all bring our attitude to work regardless of the situation. And if you look down in verse 7, it says, serve with a good attitude as to the Lord, not to people. Again, anchoring my how to my why, which is a different why because I'm belonging to Christ. I really believe that literally that connecting my work to God, to Christ, literally changes everything about that portion of the details of my life. Attitude. The third one is this: what kind of good are you bringing to work every day? Look down at verse 8. You see that phrase? Knowing that whatever good each one of you does, you will receive it back from the Lord. I wish we had about an hour, maybe two, maybe three, the rest of the afternoon to talk about Martin Luther. Martin Luther spent years and years and years working around the concept of what it means for a person who has met Jesus to go to work and to bring good. It is incredible. It makes me understand that what I do is tied into God's creative actions and energies every day in our globe. It's amazing stuff. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine was complaining about how much money he gets kept out of his paycheck all the time. Anybody had that happen lately? And he was saying, man, do you have any idea? I mean, like, look, I make this and this is what I get. And he was just griping up a storm. I got to thinking about this. What if every day on our phones there was a how you work calculator that was installed, part of the AI, okay? And every day, how you were focused, how you did good, and the kind of attitude you brought to work every day either took money out of your check or added money back into your check. How would your paycheck be? Who wants to say, I'm in on that one? I'll take that one. Yeah. Paul is trying to make the case, literally, that our work life becomes informed and transformed because of the gospel. Just like our family life becomes informed and transformed by the gospel. That's the book of Ephesians. That's the entire thing. It's built to try to help us understand that, like, one thing's not here and one thing's not over here. Let me read you one last quote here, and then we'll begin to end. Dorothy Sayers was a writer about 70 or 80 years ago that's done a ton of work around this topic. I love this quote. In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the secular vocation. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments. How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of life? The church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk and disorderly in the leisure hours and to come to church on Sundays. This was 80 years ago, okay? Here's the big statement. Watch this one. You ready? What the church should be telling him to do is this, that the very first demand that his religion makes on him is that he should make good tables. You say, wow. The practicality of Ephesians is this. The gospel should come in and literally transform the why that I work and the how that I work. And then the verse ends real quickly. Look at this. Go to the very end of the text, down in verses 9 and 10. And it shifts one last time, just like in the early part, we had the children to the parents and the parents to the children. In the second section, we have the workers to the bosses, and now we have the bosses back to the workers. It's a really interesting comparison. And it literally doesn't let the bosses out. If you happen to be a boss, you can own the whole company, you can be a boss of a few people, it doesn't matter. Here's two big insights that I think we definitely at least need to grab at the very end. Two questions, let me read them. And masters, treat your slaves the same way without threatening them, because you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with them. Translate correctly, workers, and bosses. In this case, bosses, you treat your workers the same way you would like to be treated, because what? You yourself even have a boss. This notion that just because you're the boss or you're the owner or you're the CEO or you're the sole proprietor, that you have no covering above you, Paul says, no. You have a boss that's going to evaluate you as well. So learn how to work under a boss yourself. And then he ends with a really strong statement, and the ending he comes back with is, whatever you do, don't operate with a false understanding of value and dignity. The concept of value and dignity, favoritism, that's the idea. It means somebody who kind of looks and thinks one thing, oh, I must be more valuable than you because I'm the manager, I'm the boss, I own the company, whatever. Paul says, no. That has nothing to do with it. It has to do with belonging to Christ, having your why and your how and your identity connected to your relationship with God, and that's the big idea. Let's end where we started, okay? The principle is this: the gospel of Jesus was intended to inform and transform the details of my everyday life. When we get to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 to 9, Paul splits it right down the middle. And he says, listen, I want to try to apply the gospel to the family, the world of the family. And that's what he's doing. And he talks about it from the children to the parents and the parents to the children. And then he says, what about work? This other place that we spend tons of our energy. And he says, if you will get the gospel, the intent, the truth of what the rest of Ephesians is all about into the work side of your life, it'll transform the why that you work and also the how that we work. Let's pray. Lord, thanks so much for the guidance that you've given us into how to do everyday life, because it's hard. It's confusing, very disappointing sometimes, and often kind of cloudy. It can be that way with our family, and it can be that way with our work. I pray that you would continue to use the book of Ephesians to guide us and to steer us, to inform us, and to transform us.